The boarding gate at LAX was abuzz with the usual chaos. Passengers hurrying to their flights, airport staff making last-minute announcements, the occasional overworked traveler frantically searching for a charging outlet. That is when a voice cut through the mayhem like a knife. "This is absolutely unacceptable!" Heads turned, conversations died. Standing near the first-class boarding lane was a tall, immaculately dressed woman, her manicured fingers wrapped around the handle of an expensive designer suitcase. Her name was Lauren Hastings, and she wasn't just angry, she was seething. She gestured crazily towards another woman standing a few feet away. "She doesn't belong here." The calmness with which she stood in court, the very composed black woman in a casual travel outfit, straightforward and elegant, did not flinch, nor even react, but stood there, holding her first-class boarding pass. But Lauren unraveled in that instant. "I pay top dollar for this experience, and now I have to deal with this?" Her voice had exactly the right shades of entitlement and outrage. "I'm not going anywhere near getting on this flight until this is taken care of." People around them exchanged queasy glances. Some looked away, not wanting to be involved. Others were a bit more curious and lingered, waiting to see where this was going. And then, as if summoned by sheer force of will, an airport employee appeared. A young woman named Kristen O'Neill, her face showing the kind of exhaustion that can only come from airline workers being polite to entitled passengers. "Ma'am, is there some kind of problem?" Kristen asked, her tone carefully measured. Lauren sighed dramatically, like some queen being made to explain the evident to a serf. "Yes, there's an issue. This lady is trying to board first class, and I think there is some mistake." Kristen blinked, thrown. "Miss." She turned to the woman Lauren was gesturing toward. "Do you have your boarding pass?" The woman didn't say a word, but she handed it over. Kristen scanned it, her professional smile faltering. "Seat 2A, first class." Everything checked out. She looked up, meeting the woman's steady gaze before turning back to Lauren. "She's a confirmed first-class passenger, ma'am." The shift was subtle but undeniable. A few of the nearby passengers exchanged knowing looks. A businessman in a navy blazer smirked. A young couple whispered to each other. Lauren, however, wasn't ready to back down. "There's no way," she snapped, her face contorting into something that was no longer just annoyance. It was fear. Fear of being wrong, of losing control. Feeling the weight in the moment, Kristen pulled her shoulders square. "Ma'am, each of these passengers in this line has been appropriately screened. When she's here, she has the right to be." For a second, just a second, Lauren hesitated. But then she did what people like her always did when they felt their grip slipping. She doubled down. "I want to speak to a supervisor." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gate. People were watching now, not just with curiosity, but with judgment. Kristen inhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "That won't be necessary. We need to continue boarding." Lauren stiffened, not used to being denied. She wasn't used to being challenged. But more than that, she was not used to being embarrassed. She could feel the eyes on her, and for the first time they weren't staring at her with admiration. They were staring with something else, something she did not recognize, something dangerously close to pity. With a stiff, brittle smile, she took a step backward. "Fine." The woman who had been silent the entire time calmly adjusted her bag and walked toward the gate, her expression unreadable. Lauren Hastings, however, stood frozen, watching her go. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lauren Hastings stormed onto the plane, her designer heels clicking against the carpeted aisle with controlled fury. She was still reeling from the humiliation at the gate, her mind replaying the moment over and over. People had seen, they had judged. That was unacceptable. But this was her chance to reclaim control. Her eyes darted across the first-class cabin, scanning the seats. Then she saw it, her seat, next to her. For a split second, Lauren felt her stomach drop. Then the anger returned, burning hotter than before. Absolutely not. With a sharp exhale, she turned to the nearest flight attendant, a polite yet clearly exhausted woman with a tight-lipped smile. "There's been a mistake," Lauren declared, her voice firm. "I can't sit here." The flight attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Lauren gestured to the seat next to the woman from the gate, who was now calmly adjusting her carry-on. "I need to be moved." The flight attendant's smile didn't falter, but there was a shift, something in her eyes that suggested she had been through this routine before. "Ma'am, we're fully booked in first class." "Fully booked. There aren't any open seats." Lauren's nails dug into her palms. "Find one," she demanded. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, with barely concealed reluctance, the flight attendant nodded. "I'll check with the crew." Lauren watched her disappear down the aisle before turning back toward the woman in the seat beside hers. She was completely unbothered. Lauren felt her jaw clench. How could she be so calm? After everything. The flight attendant returned moments later, her face apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I said, the flight is full." Lauren's pulse quickened. "That's ridiculous. Someone will switch with me." The attendant faltered before stepping aside. "You're welcome to ask." Lauren whirled, scanning the cabin for a sympathetic face, but all she found were passengers suddenly very invested in their books, their phones, the in-flight safety card, anything but her. "Someone switch with me, please," she tried again, louder. Silence. She felt the heat rising to her cheeks. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People always listened. They always did what she wanted. Just as the tension threatened to snap, a voice spoke. "I'll switch." Lauren turned, relief flooding her chest. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a fitted suit stood. He met her gaze with an expressionless mask, then glanced at the attendant. "That would be very nice of you, sir," he said quickly. "Thank you." Lauren didn't tarry. She reached for her carry-on and slid into the now empty seat, exhaling. There, she'd prevailed, or so she thought. Across the aisle, the woman, that woman, hadn't moved, hadn't acted as though her nose had wrinkled. Lauren's hands curled into fists. This wasn't over, not even close. Lauren's body tensed as she settled into her new seat, but the small victory did little to dissipate the frustration simmering beneath her skin. She had gotten away from her, yet somehow, it still wasn't enough. That woman was sitting across the aisle, not a care in the world, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just humiliated Lauren in front of an entire boarding gate. The flight attendants began final preparations, working their way through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Overhead bins clicked shut. The safety instructions sounded over the intercom, and passengers made last-minute adjustments. Lauren took a slow breath and willed her heart rate to slow. She was above it. She'd already fixed this. Now she just needed to get through this flight. And then, just as she thought she could move on, she saw it. Her bag. The woman had stood up, reaching for the overhead compartment above Lauren's new seat. It wasn't intentional. There simply wasn't enough space near her own row. But Lauren saw it differently. To her, it was deliberate, a challenge, a final act of defiance. Her pulse spiked. Before she could even think, her body moved. With an unnecessary force, she yanked the suitcase from the woman's hands, dragging it down from the overhead bin and letting it slam onto the floor. The sound was loud, sharp, an audible crack against the hushed anticipation of takeoff. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Lauren barely heard them. "You're not putting your things near me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. The woman didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, staring down at the suitcase before bending to pick it up, slowly, deliberately. Lauren expected anger, maybe even a scene. Instead, she got patience. Coolly, the woman dusted off the bag and adjusted the strap, like Lauren's outburst hadn't fazed her in the slightest. "This is a shared cabin," the woman said finally, her tone level. "The overhead bins don't belong to anyone." Lauren's breath caught. It was the tone, the absolute conviction, as though this was something so self-evident that any other human being would just kneel down and worship the raw brilliance of it, like a deity. That Lauren's tantrum wasn't worthy of notice. She felt a dozen gazes pressing into her skin. Passengers who turned blind eyes were now watching, their faces changing, judging, and that was unacceptable. "I don't care," Lauren spat, digging in. "I don't want your things near me." Still, the woman didn't rise to the bait. She just took a slow breath, adjusting her stance. "I'm just putting my luggage away," she said evenly. "That's all." But Lauren wasn't listening, because Lauren wasn't thinking anymore. She was spiraling. With no warning, her hands shot out again, this time grabbing the suitcase with both hands and hurling it forward. Hard. It tumbled down the aisle, landing with a heavy thud near the boarding door. The reaction was instant. People gasped. A woman several rows back slapped her hand over her mouth. Even the flight attendants, trained for chaos, froze, and the woman, still, didn't react. She simply watched, her expression inscrutable, before she finally turned toward Lauren with a slow, deliberate exhale. Then at last she spoke. That, she said, was unnecessary. Lauren's chest heaved up and down. She wasn't in control anymore, and the whole plane knew it. The silence in the cabin was stifling. The suitcase lay abandoned near the boarding door, its contents slightly shifted because of the impact. Each passenger had their eyes fixed on the scene. Some were in shock, while others looked disbelieving. Some of them reached for their phones and recorded the happenings. She felt the weight of their stares pressing into her, but she refused to back down. She was still standing there, perfectly composed, as if Lauren's outburst meant nothing. That made it worse. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with a practiced air of professionalism, quickly stepped forward. "Ma'am, you can't do that," she said, her voice laced with controlled authority. She didn't even bother to look over at her. "I don't want anything of hers within a mile of me," she said again, her voice shaking, not with fear but with rage. The flight attendant jerked in shock, looking between Lauren and the other woman, who was being maddeningly calm. "Miss, that's completely unacceptable. You are going to—" "I need to," Lauren interrupted, her tone rising. "I need to do what precisely? Let everybody just place stuff wherever they like?" A wild gesture thrown at the other woman. "I don't feel comfortable around her." There it was, that unguarded moment where she revealed too much. A flicker of realization crossed the flight attendant's face. A few passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring quietly to each other. The tension in the air shifted, and not in Lauren's favor. The nameless, unreadable woman leaned her head slightly. "You don't feel comfortable," she repeated in a perfectly neutral tone. Lauren clenched her fists. "That's what I said." The attendant pursed her lips. "Fine," she said, the friendliness drained from her tone. "It's time now to call security." A wave of murmurs rumbled across the cabin. A voice close to the front muttered, "Good." Still another passenger shook his head with a stifled chuckle. Lauren felt her stomach turn. "Excuse me?" she exclaimed, her voice on edge of hysteria. "You have just thrown off another passenger's belongings off this plane," said the flight attendant firmly. "That's a serious offense, and I really need to call security." "No, she's the one causing the problem," Lauren practically yelled, pointing accusatorily. "She is causing a scene. She is—" Two uniformed security officers stepped into the plane, and in a flash, all the energy turned. One of them, a tall man with a firm, unreadable expression, spoke first. "We've been informed of a disruptive incident. What's going on here?" Lauren exhaled in relief. Finally, someone with authority, someone who would listen. "Thank God you're here," she said. Her tact changed in an instant. Her voice took on a softer tone. Her demeanor altered. She looked distraught, her hands shaking just enough to be noticeable. "This woman attacked me. She got aggressive when I asked her to move her things. I was just defending myself." A few passengers snorted audibly. The officer frowned. "Attacked you?" "Yes," Lauren nodded vigorously. "She grabbed me. She wouldn't let go. I felt utterly unsafe." For the first time since this had all started, the woman's expression changed, just a little. A flicker of something akin to disappointment crossed her face. She knew what Lauren was doing. The officer turned to the woman. "Ma'am, is that true?" The whole cabin was silent, awaiting her words. She didn't rush. She didn't freak out. She merely blew a long, slow breath out and said, "No, it isn't." Lauren's pulse pounded in her ears. "She's lying." The officer turned to the attendant. "Can you confirm what happened?" The attendant didn't hesitate. "The woman never touched her. The only person acting in a hostile way here is her," she said, nodding toward Lauren. The dryness hit Lauren's mouth. That wasn't supposed to happen. The officer's face hardened. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." LaFoon's heart stopped. This had to be some kind of bad dream. Lauren's breath hitched. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to listen to her, not some random woman who didn't even belong here. She forced a laugh, hollow and forced. "Wait, you're taking her side? I'm the one who was attacked." The head of security didn't even flinch. "Multiple witnesses, including the flight crew, all report otherwise. Ma'am, we need you to come with us." "No," Lauren snapped, crossing her arms like a stubborn child. "I paid for this seat. I have every right to be here." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers were openly smirking now. A businessman near the front shook his head with an amused chuckle. A woman a few rows back whispered, "She really thought she could flip this, huh?" Lauren's nails dug into her palms. This wasn't fair. That woman still hadn't moved, still hadn't reacted. She sat there, her expression unreadable, as if she already knew how this would end. Lauren clenched her jaw. Fine. If nobody else was going to say it, she would. "She doesn't even belong in first class," she blurted out. "You should be questioning her." A sharp silence fell over the cabin. The officer's eyes drew closer. "And why is that, ma'am?" Lauren swallowed as abruptly. It seemed she was crossing some line, invisible though it had been. but it was too late to stop. I mean, look at her, she said in a lower voice now, the venom still there. Does she really look like someone who flies first class? The moment the words left her mouth, she knew. She had lost. A man near the back let out a sharp laugh, muttering, "Oh, she's done." Someone else whispered, "Did she really just say that?" The lead officer exhaled through his nose, the kind of long, measured breath of a man who had seen this scenario play out too many times. Then, before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Lauren froze, heads turned toward the front of the plane. A tall man in an immaculately tailored suit stepped into the cabin, flanked by two airline executives. He walked with purpose, his presence demanding attention without a single word. The cabin shifted. Passengers straightened. The flight attendant stepped aside. Even the security officer stood a little taller. Lauren's pulse spiked. Who? Who was this? The man's keen eyes locked onto her, but when he spoke, his words were elsewhere. "Miss Sinclair, I am so sorry," he said, his voice level but firm. "We didn't know she was on this flight." Lauren's stomach fell. Sinclair? She hardly heard the hushed murmurs building around her. The muttered, "Wait, what?" The hushed, "Oh my God, is she—" But one voice came through loud and clear, her own. "Who?" The executive turned to her then, his face cool and impassive. "You just harassed and attempted to remove the CEO and chief board member of this airline from her own flight." Dead silence. Lauren stopped breathing. Lauren's brain refused to process the words. CEO? Board member? That woman? No, it wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of mistake, some sick joke. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The tension in the cabin had thickened, pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers started. "She owns the airline? No way. Oh, she's finished." Passengers exchanged looks of shock, some shaking their heads in quiet amusement. Others, the ones who had watched Lauren's tantrum unfold from the start, now stared at her with open disdain. She felt exposed. The executive didn't wait for her to catch up. He turned back to the woman, Miss Sinclair, with nothing but cool professionalism. "I assure you this situation will be handled appropriately." Miss Sinclair, who had remained composed through everything, nodded once. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't even look at Lauren, and somehow that made it worse. Lauren finally found her voice. I didn't know." It came out weaker than she intended. The executive's eyes snapped back to her, and for the first time since his foot had stepped onto the plane, his expression hardened. "That's exactly the problem." The words slapped her like a palm. The murmurs grew louder. Lauren's hands clenched into fists. "No, I mean—" She breathed in sharply, trying to regain her composure. "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding." Nobody believed her, not the passengers, not the flight attendants, certainly not the security officers, who were still standing there waiting for their next order. Miss Sinclair finally moved. She stood up, not aggressively, not in anger, just with the kind of quiet control that made it clear who had real power in the room. And then for the first time, she looked Lauren directly in the eyes. "You didn't know," she said, voice even. "But you assumed." The words lay heavy and final over the cabin. Lauren's mouth opened, but she had nothing, because there was nothing she could say. She had assumed, and now she was paying for it. The lead security officer cleared his throat. "Miss Hastings, you will be removed from this flight immediately." Lauren whipped around. No, wait." Passengers were watching, some openly smirking, others shaking their heads. "You can't do this," Lauren snapped, panic creeping into her voice. I have places to be." "Not on this airline," the officer said, already stepping forward. Lauren lunged toward Miss Sinclair, desperate, grasping at anything to fix this. "Please," she gasped. "I swear, I didn't mean—" Miss Sinclair didn't even blink. She simply turned, took her seat, and looked away. Like Lauren was already gone. Barely feeling her feet move, Lauren was escorted by the security people toward the exit. It wasn't just the humiliation tearing through her chest, but the eyes, the judgment, the knowing smirks that seemed to tell it all. People weren't just watching her anymore. They were enjoying this. As she stumbled down the aisle past the first-class passengers, one of the men in a business suit let out a low chuckle. The woman in the aisle seat leaned in to whisper something to her husband, shaking her head, and then applause. It started with just one person. A slow, deliberate clap from a passenger near the back, then another, then another. Lauren's face burned. No, she muttered under her breath, panic clawing at her throat. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She whipped her head toward Miss Sinclair, who had already settled back into her seat, completely unfazed. She wasn't watching Lauren. She wasn't thinking about Lauren. She had already moved on. Lauren's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about getting kicked off the plane. This was bigger. People had their phones out. They were recording, posting, commenting. Her name was already spreading. The realization sent a new kind of fear through her, a fear that had nothing to do with this flight. Down the jet bridge, she was escorted by security, the steps heavier and heavier. By the time they stepped into the terminal, an airline representative waited for her. His hand grasped a folder. His expression wasn't telling anything. Lauren swallowed hard. "Miss Hastings," he said, his tone clipped, professional, final. She tried forcing a smile as desperation attempted to save what little was left of her dignity. "Listen, I think there's been a—" He didn't let her finish. "You are hereby banned from flying with our airline henceforth." The world leaned a little. She looked up. "What's that?" He was holding out the folder to her. "You will be receiving this on an official note via email. Any attempt to book future travel with us will be automatically declined." Lauren's breath caught. "This isn't—" She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. You can't do this to me." The representative didn't blink. "Actually, we can, and we just did." Lauren's heart pounded. "You don't understand. I have connections. He leaned sideways. "And yet here we are." She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. Because she had lost. Lauren stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, clutching the folder so tightly, her nails almost pierced through the heavy paper. The drone of the airport was far away, muffled under the weight of reality closing in on her. This wasn't about embarrassment anymore. This was ruin. She breathed in shallowly and irregularly. She glanced around, hoping, praying for some kind of getaway, some magic way of taking it all back. Then the reality of her nightmare really hit home. People were staring at her, not just staring, recognizing. Phones were out, screens flickered, fingers flew upon their keyboards. Lauren swallowed hard. This was going viral. She turned, almost colliding with a girl holding up her phone, its screen alight. The headline at the top of the trending page hit her like a freight train. Entitled woman kicked off flight after meltdown, and you won't believe who she insulted. Lauren's stomach dropped. No, 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 no. Her hands also shook as she scrolled through comments flooding social media, each sharper than the last. She really thought she could get away with this? What's that saying? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I don't care how rich she is, she's done. Wait till she sees herself on every news channel by morning. Lauren's breath came in quick gasps. She needed to fix this. She stumbled toward a row of chairs near the terminal's large windows, sinking into one as she pulled out her phone. Damage control. That's all this was. She just needed to apologize, craft the right words, look remorseful. People forgave these things all the time, didn't they? She opened her camera, staring at her reflection. Her perfect hair was rumpled, her designer blouse wrinkled, and the usual confident smirk gone, replaced by wide, frantic eyes. She swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and hit record. I made a terrible mistake." Her voice cracked perfect. Vulnerability sold. She had seen dozens of apology videos go viral. This could work. This had to work. Tears welled up. In real or not, they didn't matter. She just needed people to believe them. She sniffled. "I was overwhelmed. I was frustrated. I let my emotions get the best of me, and I said things that ping." A notification popped up. Someone had sent her a link. Curious, she swiped up, and the second she did, her entire body went cold. The video, the one she hadn't known existed, the one someone had recorded before she had been kicked off the flight. Her own voice, crystal clear over the hum of the airport. "She doesn't even belong in first class. Look at her." Lauren's blood turned to ice. Her own words. There was no coming back from this. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone, staring at her own reflection in the darkened airport window. This wasn't just one bad moment. This was the end of everything. And as the realization settled deep in her chest, heavy and inescapable, a new notification popped up. Breaking luxury brand drops Lauren Hastings after viral flight incident. And then another. Major PR firm announces they will no longer represent Hastings following public outcry. Then another. CEO of leading travel company responds, "This kind of behavior has no place in our industry." Lauren's vision blurred. She had thought the worst was behind her when they had pulled her off that plane. She had been wrong. This wasn't just a scandal, this was a fall. A slow, relentless free fall, one that wouldn't end when she left this airport, when she got in her car, when she shut the doors to her penthouse and locked herself away. Because this was forever. And for the first time in her life, Lauren Hastings realized it was something from which she couldn't buy her way out.